good to be back with you again today, Caleb. And for those tuning in, last time, our last discussion, we shifted towards talking about the historical progression of ideas and where some of the things we've been talking about have their roots, their foundations. I was thinking about this idea as we're getting started this morning. I just introduced this as we're pulling strings, trying to figure out where these ideas are rooted. It reminds me of the divided kingdom, where in the northern kingdom, it constantly goes back to Jeroboam. Like Jeroboam's where this started, and he is what the things he introduced. No matter where they end up, it goes back to the sins of Jeroboam, right? And that's sort of what we're trying to do, is get back. Is where's our Jeroboam? Where's the place where we really connected to now got off? And so we started with Descartes and the sort of shift in the foundations of knowing, of wisdom and knowledge, shifting from a received knowledge to a knowledge that flows out from us and from our minds. And today we want to talk a little bit more about that. There's kind of two schools of thought that come out of that movement. And one is that knowledge comes from experience, that the practical, tangible ways we interact, and through that experience we gain knowledge, is kind of the scientific method, et cetera. And then another is more the theoretical, which is what we can think of and work through in our minds. And while these don't always have to be competitive, they often are. But both of them are rooted in the notion that knowledge and what is true starts right here in the individual mind. And so, Ken, how do these two ideas end up competing, and how does that flow out there from Descartes into history?
Yeah, so as you were mentioning, Descartes starts off what I would call like the humanistic foundation of philosophy, and you mentioned that as well. It's like it's in the human perception that there's a grounded reality, or the ability to reason or perceive reality. Descartes was really kind of the first what's called rationalist. So as Stephen mentioned, there are two sides of this debate that's going to come out. Rationalism, which is going to be focused more on the human reason and the ability to rationalize or reason certain truths of reality, and that there are in the human mind structures and perceptions that are real and that are true. And this is sometimes called a priori. A priori knowledge is knowledge that we can arrive to without actually experiencing it. So I may not be able to experience some geometry concept. I don't really think I saw a lot of parallelograms in my life.Maybe implicitly, yes, I did, but I can rationalize and understand that. And a lot of mathematics is based upon a rationalistic or a priori thing, things we don't have to experience, but through human mind we can reason towards. And Descartes was very much like that, because his basic starting point was, I think, therefore I am. This is rationalistic in terms of its foundation. Where did the empiricists come after Descartes, especially guys like John Locke, who was really probably the most famous empiricist now? Obviously, there are going to be different styles of rationalism and different styles of empiricism, and there's going to be integrated and mixed forms of both, as later on, famously, Immanuel Kant is trying to kind of harmonize the two and bring people together on that. But Locke he takes, I would argue, he takes Descartes' first point of humanistic perception. And even Descartes, even though he's a rationalist, is still focused on perception. I think, therefore I am. So I'm thinking, I'm perceiving, I have this epistemology of knowledge that's there. Well, Locke, his point is, our knowledge is not pre-programmed. We're not zapped into it. And a baby doesn't just pop out with all this knowledge. We gain knowledge through experience, through interaction, through engaging in the world around us. And as Steve and I and other conversations we've had, and we're not the first ones to note this debate between knowledge, cosmology, and ontology in terms of it existing in terms of a reality that humans assent to through reason versus a more integrated experiential form, this debate goes all the way back to Plato versus Aristotle. Plato would probably be more in the rationalistic camp, and Aristotle would be more in the empiricist camp of experience, our knowledge through experience and interaction in the world around us. And so Locke is the one that kind of jettisons off and starts. And from Locke, you're going to have others, Berkeley, Hume. What was the other guy's name? I got his name down here. Bacon, Francis Bacon. I've not read a lot of Bacon, just a little bit of some of his blurbs and excerpts. But those guys are going to kind of depart from Descartes and the other rationalists that would come from him, because they're going to see knowledge as things that we experience. And what they want to try to do with that empirical knowledge is make it universal. Basically saying, it's not going to depend on Stephen's thought process or reason or Caleb's thought process or reason. We can get to a grounded sense of knowledge and epistemology based upon observational knowledge. And so if Stephen goes and weighs out a pound or a kilogram, I can do the same thing in Puerto Rico or across the world. That's what they're going to try to situate human knowledge in terms of the world or the universe around them, rather than necessarily being a reality in terms of the individual. And so in some ways, the empiricists are going to presuppose the groundedness of human knowledge. And we can get into that some more, but I hope that's a little bit of a map between the debate. So what are you, I guess what I didn't touch on is like, why is it important? I guess why is it important to discuss or delineate between, why were they delineating between reason versus experiential knowledge? What are your thoughts on all that?
So I think one thing that comes out of this, and we're still dealing with it now, is a constant desire to find a singular explanation for things that don't have singular explanation. So when we talk about knowledge, you have these competing camps. I think in the best case, people just acknowledge that there are things you learn through experience, and then there are things that you reason out from those experiences, right? That all knowledge can't come from experience, but neither can all knowledge come through reasoning. And we might put it in just the simplest terms, the difference between book knowledge and on-the-job training. But most people acknowledge you need both, right? You need to learn something out of a book before you go and experience, and especially if it's a dangerous type thing, there's some safety precautions and so forth that come from that sort of rational mind approach. But then eventually the rational without the tangible is always going to fail. So I think part of the problem that comes out of this is a desire to sort of root all knowledge in one place. But what's worse than all of that is both of these are the humanist, right? That and I think this is the idea that if I can't reason through it, or I haven't experienced it, then I can't know something's true, right? And so that's
the empiricist like mantra almost. Yes. Like you have to have experience to have knowledge.
Yes. Yeah. And so I mean, Caleb's from Missouri. It's the show me state.
Yeah.
This is an empiricist mantra, right? Mm-hmm. If I can't see it, if I can't examine it. And I think this even goes to like biblical interpretation. When people look at doubting Thomas, right? They look at Thomas, and where Jesus makes a commendation that is slight in comparison to a commendation of those who will accept this reality without, right? So blessed are you because you believe this, you've seen and touched, and so you believe it. Well, more blessed are those who won't be able to see and touch and who will still believe. And yet Thomas in the modern era, and even among some of my brethren, is hailed as sort of an exemplar of how we ought to approach biblical study, which is have this skepticism that is overcome with data, right? Empirical research or rationality will work us through those doubts. And I think that's an unfair assessment of what's going on with Thomas, and I think it's an unfair assessment of how we ought to approach the knowledge of God. And yet none of that. It's not a rejection. I don't want to say you should reject empirical knowledge outright, or that you should reject rationality outright. It's just that we need to acknowledge limitations. And I think that's what comes out of this is there's no acknowledgement of limitations. We see that in the science world today. There's not people say, I hear all the time, scientists, people will talk about science and scientists like, look, they're just explorers. And when they get new information, they process that. That's not at all the reality.
Yep.
They have a way over assessment of their ability to know things, and a total lack of appreciation that they need to accept an external reality, an external knowledge, which they would compare their knowledge. So I would say that we should take all of our empiricism and put it underneath the revelation of God, and that things that we are taking in through empiricism, we should acknowledge that our perceptions are limited. They're limited to the nature that we live in. They're limited to our levels of understanding. And of course, through empiricism, people have learned all kinds of false things, right? Because they're experiencing and they're drawing the wrong conclusions from those experiences. And history, the history of science is full of examples of people through empiricism that arrived at certain conclusions that became less and less certain as history went along. But if we come at it with that air of humility that says, look, we're finite creatures within a finite creation, and we are making educated guesses as we go along underneath the rule of the creator who knows all, that would help us a lot in our approach. And it would keep us maybe from being so arrogant and bombastic in our conclusions. And the consequences of that, the consequences of those conclusions is people make policies, people make legislation and rule whole countries based on erroneous conclusions, either drawn through rationalism or empiricism, are overwhelming. So it's the idea to me is not to choose one of these paths or to denigrate one over the other, but the problem as a whole is to set either one of these humanistic origins of knowledge as the ultimate arbiter of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the problem that we're going to see, as you're mentioning here, is that the debate started with empiricism versus rationalism as an attempt to reduce knowledge to a certain avenue. And they had their reasons for doing that. Descartes had a particular reason for aligning with rationalism. Hume had very specific reasons for aligning with empiricism. And as we kind of mentioned in the previous conversation, the forms of epistemology that these thinkers, these philosophers and men and women developed are going to lead over into their views of cosmology, are going to lead over into their views of ontology as well. And many times the people wouldn't always start with epistemology. They would have a particular form of cosmology that would then lead them to a backward form of epistemology or vice versa. And as Stephen was mentioning here, I think the thing we really have to stress with this whole epistemological discussion of knowledge is that both camps, rational and empirical, were presupposing a grounded perception or a real perception of human interaction and human knowledge. And that presupposition is not really challenged. And even later, when, as I mentioned with Kant, as he sees what Stephen was talking about is the critique of being like, well, we can't really just isolate empirical or experiential knowledge, and we can't isolate rational. There's clear that both sides are making valid points. And so guys like Kant and others are trying to bring these both together. Well, the problem is they recognize that the separation and the reductionist of epistemological camps has caused a rift, and that there's really no resolution. So they try to bring them back in together. But the bringing and the attempted unifications of rationalism and empiricism are still predicated. They're built on this human form. And so even Kant is not like, well, we need to get back to a humble or even like a submissive biblical form of knowledge. And I would say even too, because it's built upon a humanist form that exalts human reason, or even in the case of empiricism, human perception, this totally destroys many of the forms of ways of knowing. And knowing through, and there, it's not an accident that today we oftentimes do not talk about knowing through a form of action. Last time I mentioned Blaise Pascal, and he has this kind of idea of praxis, of like you can know, and faith is tied into a knowing that is done through action. And the rationalists and empiricists of the modernist movement will blast him and say, oh, he's just fake it till you make it, because they can't conceive of a form of knowledge that's developed through pattern and habit. And they cannot conceive of knowledge that comes through service or submission or love or dedication. Like, these forms of knowing are completely outside of their sphere and their center of knowledge. And I'm not trying to endorse N.T. Wright, but N.T. Wright has a lot of really good points on the epistemology of love, and that loving can be a form of knowing. And that, even as Stephen's talking about, faith, accepting the revelation of God, is a form of knowing. And the Hebrew writer speaks of this. By faith we know, as he says in Hebrews chapter 11. And that idea of faith is been positioned in terms of modernism as antithetical, as against, faith is against science, faith is against knowledge. Why? Because they have defined the limits of knowledge based upon humanistic rationalism or empiricism, or even a mixture of the two, and they've jettisoned any other form of knowing that's outside of their humanistic reason. Yeah. And it's very skewed, but it goes back to Stephen's point. If you see their point of epistemology, you're going to have a tough time thinking outside of their limited box, and you're just going to fall subject to it, because you've already seeded the ground. You're already fighting in their battlefield, and you're going to be fighting uphill all the way, and you're ultimately going to lose if you buy into their epistemological claim.
Yeah, and along those lines, one of the things that's happened is knowledge has been made into a hierarchy based on precision, right? So the more precise you can know something, then sort of the truer that knowledge is, which means math ends up at the top, right? Things that can have clear measurements and just precision. We call it hard science. And then in somewhat a derogatory way, we refer to sciences that are less precise as the soft sciences. Yeah. Now, I think soft science departments, especially because they've been taken over by modernists and postmodernists, are soft in lots of ways. But and so
they're soft not in their epistemological claims necessarily, right, or their epistemological legitimacy is not necessarily soft, but maybe right, their lack of rigor and lack of clarity, etc.
Yeah, their acceptance of bad assumptions is what makes soft, them soft. Right. But the idea, this affects, for instance, our interpretation of the Bible, that we are reading passages that are poetic in nature. And so the interpretation is, it's not that there's not true things there, but they don't have the same precision as maybe, a frank statement. And even the frank statements involve some degree of interpretation. And so what's happened is that the elements of the Bible that we're able to sort of squeeze into a mathematical formula, A plus B equals C. Mm-hmm. If we're able to squeeze it into that, we prioritize those portions of the Bible as more important knowledge than maybe apocalyptic language, for instance, which is more difficult. And so just by virtue of it being easier to interpret, it becomes more important by default. And so then people will just never study the book of Revelation, or maybe they'll study that because it's in the New Testament, but they'll never study Ezekiel or the more difficult portions of Daniel. They'll just stick to the narrative, which is more, it's more structured and more easy to understand. And so they'll stay there where you can have the hard science of interpretation, or at least in their minds, they think that, and then stay away from the more nebulous portions that are harder to be precise about. And that's knowledge in general. I've been talking about this recently in my home, and I preached a sermon about it recently, the idea of beauty. So I think one of the consequences of all this, you take an idea like beauty, and because we can't draw sharp and precise lines of what's beautiful and what's not, then what happens is we say, well, beauty is actually just something that's completely subjective, and you really can't say anything about beauty. And somebody might say something's ugly, but that's just really the way they feel about it, and it's just their opinion and their perception of that. And so beauty, it doesn't belong. It's a different kind of truth. There may be some truth to that, but it's very personal, right? And it can't be universal because it can't be precise. And yet God says things are beautiful, and he says they are ugly. And so he speaks in very definitive ways when he uses that terminology, and not in a way that's subjective. Right. And so what modernist ideas and these modernist notions of epistemology, of rationalism or empiricism, it basically it bifurcates knowledge into what you can really know. That would be a way to say it. What you can really know,
objective,
you can't really know.
Yep. Objective, subjective split.
Absolutely. Right. And objective and as opposed to, okay, here is something that is certainly more precise, but this thing that's less precise is no less true. I would put the Proverbs into this category, right? Mm-hmm. We look at the Proverbs, and the Proverbs are true, even though they're not without exception. But because of our empiricism and rationalism, we want to come up with like mathematical formulas that are always true. And so we read the Proverbs and we want them to either always be true, or if they have an exception, then they're not really true, are they? No, things can be true while having exceptions and still be true in pattern and form and shape. And so I think that makes it difficult for people to interpret, for instance, the Proverbs, because of this very thing we're talking about, because the way we know is at odds with the way the Bible is communicating there.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this aspect of what I believe Stephen's talking about in terms of reductionism is present in both rationalism and empiricism, because the reductionism to precise laws and trying to get down to what is, in their approach, universally true. So anything that has an exception for them cannot be true. So ultimately, this leads down to trying to get down to the base common denominator. Like, we're going to reject anything of context, reject anything of complexity in terms of countervailing points. We try to get down to this very specific element of what we can say, yes, we have absolute confidence on. And this is ultimately the pattern of Descartes, right? Descartes is trying to get down and say, well, let's strip away all the aspects of God and all the presuppositions, and how can I have confidence in and even that I exist and reason from myself. The humanistic approach is dependent upon a reductionist move. But then two things produce from that. Number one, as Stephen's saying, precision in terms of being able to reduce and isolate is seen as automatically a good thing. But in so doing, that creates a warped version of whatever you're analyzing. It breaks down the patterns and the interconnectedness of whatever that thing is, and creates an artificial bubble or an environment, like a test tube that you're looking at it through. And then not only does it create isolation that's built upon that reductionist separation, but it also creates this arrogance of, I can fully understand this because it's based upon my perception and my reason or the empirical perception of it there. And this is oftentimes where people will talk about hyper-rationality. Hyper-rationality is oftentimes used, even among brethren, in terms of citing this phenomena, is the idea that we can have a full understanding of the reality of any object or thing. Brother Gardner Hall has a really good book called Conviction versus Mercy. And he outlines this kind of impulse, even among our brethren, to treat things or even biblical interpretation as hyper-rational. Like, we can understand everything about it. And I first encountered this impulse, as Stephen is talking about, this filters down and affects our hermeneutic and our way of reading the Bible. I encountered this when I was in Texas, where people would come up to me, and when I was reading the prophets or reading Revelation or other things like that, they wouldn't like the aspects that were beyond them. So they would say, well, don't you know, Caleb, that the Bible was written at a third grade reading level? And I'm like, no. What? Like, I couldn't understand where that assertion, that was a very common assertion, especially among older Christians, where it came from and why it was there. And it goes exactly what Stephen was talking about. They want to have this full understanding of, like, well, we fully understand everything about the Bible. And I know there's some arguments that have to do with things being, clear and understandable, and how would God communicate a truth to us that we could not understand? But there's a difference between the ability to understand something and then our just innate capture of it. I would argue is like, oh, it was condescended to us in all manners. I know we'll get into that hopefully later on, but that idea of like, well, I should be able to understand the Bible completely as I am, so it has to be written at a third grade reading level, crushes the Bible down to a very basic plain Jane thing, which goes to the same thing Stephen was discussing about these things that are written in the Bible that our brotherhood has specifically grasped onto. What I regard as the nomos, or things that are law, like direct statements, will grasp onto that and say, yes, that has authoritative weight, or a clear example has authoritative weight. But what about the narrative arc of a text? What about a story, which most of the Bible is written in narrative fashion? Does that have authority? Does that communicate a symbolic pattern that is authoritative over me? Our brethren don't really have good answers to this. They don't like the mythos, the story of it, because in their minds, they can't reduce that down to a declaration of a precision, and therefore be able to hyper-rationalize that thing. And that creates a lot of problems in terms of biblical interpretation. So full agreement with Stephen on this. Yeah. This idea, this debate of rationalism, empiricism, and even humanistic epistemology is not some far off thing that existed in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. No, it has been given to us, and in much of our knowledge as adopted in the public school system, universities, is filtered through these epistemological assumptions that then when we go to the Bible, we bring that baggage with us and then try to jam the Bible into the epistemological box that we have, rather than taking the biblical epistemological claims, which is very tough because it will require, to adopt a biblical and a theistic epistemology will require a rejection of those kind of presupposed epistemological claims we've received through our families, our societies, our jobs, etc. And that's a very challenging move.
Yeah. Let me offer a clarification here from my own standpoint that, as Caleb mentions, the overarching narrative, a lot of people are using that to dispense with any precise knowledge, right? That the Bible is just a narrative. And so that word just is doing a lot of work there. So it's just a narrative. Well, it is a narrative. But when people hear that it's just a narrative, then they reject that there is that the narrative is of importance at all, right? So you end up, again, you're pushing to the extremes of, listen, it's either a book of rules or it's a narrative, rather than that the narrative is teaching us a way of living that sometimes has precision in the form of commands or examples, and sometimes is less precise, but not without informative weight and instructive weight. So, I mean, to give an example, even with a command in James chapter 4, where he's talking about the person who makes their plans, and we ought to say, if the Lord wills. Well, you can either take that as a strict instruction to say the words, if the Lord wills, or you can look at that as what I think most people do. You can look at that as developing a mentality of recognition, acknowledgement, and dependence upon God's providence in your life at all times, even if you don't verbatim say these words every time you say what you're going to do. And I have known people, because they're rooted in that sort of a everything's down to precision, that they've made it into, if they hear a brother say, yeah, I'm planning on going over there tomorrow, they go, that brother just sinned, because he did not say, if the Lord wills. And so, I would say, well, I'd want to examine that brother. That brother may be acknowledging that, but then didn't say, I don't think he pompously said, I'm planning on going. And even the fact that he said, I'm planning, suggests an acknowledgement of the limitations. And so, you can take that away and essentially be like the Pharisees and make an overly precise application where beyond what God's word instructs, or in that narrative, you can say, this is the way we ought to be living our lives. But what we've done is made those two compete, where you got to choose one or the other, where you've got all precision or all imprecision. Mm-hmm. And neither one of those is true. There's a spectrum of instruction, some that is, varying degrees of precision, and then some that is far more advice driven. I mean, I would take what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. There's elements there where it seems that, well, quite clearly that he's saying, this is advice, but I am not giving you explicit demands. I am telling you, here is what's going to be overall better, but here's another possibility. I just think this is going to be better. And we struggle with that, again, because we want everything just mapped out. I mean, I've been in Bible classes. Somebody says, is this wrong or right? And we work through the possibilities of that and how that plays out in individual lives. And at the end of that whole discussion, they go, yeah, but is it wrong or right? What they are doing is rooting themselves in this very thing we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Yes or no. Everything should be yes or no. It's precise calculation out to the correct or incorrect answer. And ultimately, I was talking about this with somebody yesterday. When I was in high school, I liked math. And one of the reasons I said I liked math and did not like literature is because in math, the answers were always either correct or incorrect. Mm-hmm. Like, I didn't have to wonder, if this answer was, the teacher didn't look at it and go, well, that's an interesting way to approach it. It was right or wrong. But in literature, it was, they asked you more conceptual questions about who was the most important character, what are the themes, and so you're having to think in those ways. And ultimately what it felt like was there really wasn't a right or wrong answer. And, but the truth is that as I look back, it was laziness of thought, right? I wanted things to be easier. Now, we don't think of math as easy, but really it is, from the standpoint of you don't have to think abstractly, and you don't have to, well, there are ways you have to think abstractly, but you don't, you follow the rules and you get to the right conclusion. And versus, and I know there's
I would
hierarchy.
say to maybe clarify here. I would say you don't have to think as contextually.
Yeah.
So for me, the issue is context of what you're talking about. Because
Right.
mathematician, if anyone's in mathematics, are going to be like, well, that's all we do is we think abstractly.
Sure. Yeah,
right? And what they mean by abstractly in that situation is they mean they're not limited by a book or a empirical experience. Like all of them, they're dealing more theoretical, right? Not grounded to the material. But I think what I understand you're talking about is from an abstract in more of like, is it limited by a context? Because what I would argue that the both rationalistic and empiricist form is a reduction away from context.
Yes.
Because context makes things dirty. Subjectivity is context. It's you being embodied, your experience, your point of view that's affecting our knowledge. Well, we don't want that. So we want to strip away all the variables, all the context, and get down to what's actually reality. And in that sense, mathematics is not abstract. It's not contextual because it is the removal of all of those components and variables down to what they think is pure knowledge. And same thing, the rationalists and the empiricists both do that, because the whole idea, especially with empiricism or empirical knowledge, is the idea or the myth of repeatability. Like I can strip it down and it doesn't matter if Caleb does it, if Stephen does it, if a Chinese guy does it, or someone in Australia, they're going to get the exact same thing. And that presupposition of a decontextualized knowledge being more real, and Stephen's point, as I'm understanding him, is there's an ease about that, or a seductiveness about the reduction that makes it simple. Well, I don't have to encounter the variables of Stephen's context to determine if his perception is right or wrong. I don't have to go into all these things about his age, his experience, and all that kind of stuff. I can ignore all that and get to what's really fundamental. And that is a huge, huge assumption. Right?
Let me give a few examples of this as far as how this affects our, our way of seeing who God is and what God wants from us. In Matthew 23, Jesus chastises the scribes and Pharisees, and he says, "You tithe the anise and cumin, but you've neglected the weightier matters of the law." Now, there's a tediousness to counting out the seeds and tithing every little thing. So there's a difficulty to it. Mm-hmm. But there's also an ease to it because it is precisely calculable. And I can say, I have done that.
Yeah.
But
that's a great example.
But how do I calculate whether or not I've done justice and mercy? How do I calculate whether I've done faith? Right? This is not a precise, and I think we understand that at some level. We understand that at the end of the day, we can't say at the end of the day, I have accomplished this thing with precision. It is more of you have to live this out. It cannot be compartmentalized. It cannot be, it's more of, it has to be your thought process, but you don't have to be in a constant thought process about tithing. You just sit down, you do it, and you walk away from it.
Yeah.
But you can't walk away from justice and mercy and love and faith. And, these are concepts that have to just dwell in you. So I think that's one way where this sort of division of knowledge puts us into the same categories that Jesus is condemning. And it naturally pushes us that direction. So we have to fight against that. And one of the ways is to kind of harmonize, bring these ways of knowing back together. Another element that I think comes out of that is when we are, okay, so for instance, when we're talking about eldership, when we're talking about qualifications of elders, one of the things that we see happening is that we gravitate towards the calculable, the precise, and have less to say about the imprecise. it's very easy to talk about whether a man's married or not, whether he has children. And then we spend lots and lots of time talking about whether or not all or some of those children have to be faithful. But we rarely spend time arguing about what it means to be hospitable, which is one of the descriptions, or what it means. I mean, or if we do, we minimize it. And we say, well, I mean, there's a wide range in which somebody could still be hospitable. Okay, maybe there's a range, but it's not infinite. At some point, a man is not hospitable. And we need to have some idea as to what that looks like. But what happens is, because we have this, we're pressed towards this precision, we end up focusing on this to the neglect of this. And I'll give you just one more example that I think is so pertinent, and that is our inability to explain the Trinity, because we cannot put this into epistemological or completely rational thought processes. And in fact, every person in history who has tried in some epistemological way, or rather some empiricist way, to identify the Trinity. I don't care if they're using the three-leaf clover or an egg or the Father, Son, husband modes. They're all detracting from the reality of the Trinity, which transcends every one of those descriptions. Every one of those descriptions falls short in some way. And we have to wrestle with that reality, that no matter how we try to explain this in ways that are experiential for us, oh, you've experienced something like the Trinity. No, I mean, there are elements there, sure.
Yeah.
But at some point that falls into, it falls into a heresy, right? That you're actually describing multiple gods, or you're actually describing one person broken up into various personalities, or you're actually, you're not actually describing what the Bible describes, which what it describes transcends both of these ways of knowing. You cannot rationally by yourself arrive. It is received knowledge. You cannot rationally arrive at the Trinity from your own mind. You cannot empirically arrive there. You must take the words of God, the way he describes himself, and accept that this is a reality that is outside my experience and my ways of thinking.
Yep. Amen. Well put. I totally agree with that. And so the product of hyper-rationality and the product of arrogant knowledge, of a prioritization of so-called precise knowledge, right, is definitely modernistic products that we have. And it's interesting, as you were pointing out, like the abstract or more contextualized things. And I think your example of Proverbs is really good. We've almost gotten to the point we swing on one side of the pendulum or the other on this. Like when I was growing up in the church, you had kind of two camps, especially in regards to modesty. You had one camp that wanted to kind of go to the extreme of being like, we can specify the dress code down to the exact centimeter. And then you have the other camp who would say stuff like, well, modesty is just a matter of perception. It's just a matter of spirit, and God doesn't have a dress code. And like what they're dealing with are these kind of back and forth of whether hyper rationality, or later it's kind of like the recontextualization to a generalist form is more like the postmodern move that we're going to see later on. But what they're struggling with is that the Bible does not conform to modernistic or postmodernistic epistemological standards. And does the Bible require you to use judgment? Yes. And here's the big problem is that people think, well, if it's not precise, if it's not in this modernistic form, then we can't say it's a sin or not. If we can't say it's a sin or not, then it's just pure willy-nilly ecumenicalism or fill in the blank relativism. Well, no. John 7:24, Jesus says, do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. And so God's going to judge our use of judgment on this. He is going to hold us accountable for the Proverbs and the truths in the Proverbs, just as he will in the things that are more precise. But these, for me, a lot of this struggle that our brotherhood has had in encountering the epistemological things, the epistemological battles are due somewhat to our inability to even be aware of the epistemological issue at all. We just kind of have received either the modernistic or more prevalent, I think, in a lot of younger generations today, more the postmodernistic epistemological assumptions. And then we go to the biblical text with this baggage, with these filters, and then we begin to pick and choose, select, deselect all these things, or we go and have our judgment totally moved on this. And we don't stop and think, what does the Bible have to say about this? And trying to then challenge some of those presuppositions that we have.
Yeah, and I think just to point out in that example, the modesty, I think it's a great example. You've got on the one hand, you've got somebody's going to be called a legalist because they're making rules where God is not, right? That they are trying to come up with more precision than God has given. Right. But then on the other side, what we think is these people are rejecting that, but they're actually inhabiting the same space, because what they're saying is, unless God gives me precision, I will dismiss all boundaries, right? Yeah. So they're both legalists, to use that very nebulous term. They're both demanding modernist epistemology just from different sides. They're both pushing each other to the extremes, right? So you got this, they're rejecting this over precision on the one side, but in doing that, they're saying, I will not hear God's wisdom on this unless it is communicated in precise terms. Mm-hmm. So they're both a product of this same thing. It's not like one is accepting that and the other's rejecting that. No, they're just ending up, they're both ending up in error at extremes, because they've accepted this notion that unless something is communicated with total precision, then I really can't take anything from it. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important to understand that we're not just dealing with like one person is affected by this philosophy and the other is not. No, they're both being affected by the philosophy. They're just going in different directions with it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot too about the decontextualization in humanist forms that hopefully when we get to discussions of like individualism and culture, we'll begin to see how these epistemological movements of humanistic and then reductionist separation impacts it, because knowledge is going to be something like, even in the question of sin, it's going to be like, well, can you precisely in a hyper-rationalistic form define this action as sinful or not sinful? And then depending on that answer, if they say, well, no, I can't, then it's just like, well, I can do whatever I want. There's no communal knowledge. There's no hierarchical submission. There's no integrated into a body whatsoever. It's stripping it out. And as we mentioned in the last conversation, oftentimes epistemological issues with modernism are described as like a brain in a jar. We're going to be able to strip everything back and just get to this pure knowledge, the pure rationalism or pure empirical perception. And what we see in both of these camps that do filter down, and our society has had hundreds of years to be built on this, and so much of our education system, our law, our government, our entertainment, so much of this is either built on or reifies on a continual basis and rebuilds these assumptions of modernistic rationalism and empiricism or humanistic epistemology. Is when we try to move beyond that, people think that they will immediately strawman us and be like, well, Caleb's against rationalism. Caleb's against logic. It's like, or Stephen, he doesn't believe observational knowledge is a real thing. It's like, no, just because that's the kind of test tube that they've constructed and that we've lived in doesn't mean that we destroy all of these other forms of knowledge. We're looking for a more holistic and a more integrated way that doesn't destroy the kernels of truth of rationalism or empiricism, but brings it into its proper order in terms of God, revelation, the world we live in, and yes, our perception. We're not stripping it away. We're trying to add to bring it into more an accurate reflection of reality. But it's very difficult because if you try to discuss these things with modernists, they will try to say all that subjective perception, all of that context is not real.
Mm-hmm.
We have reality. And that arrogant assumption is presupposed on their ability to even have confidence in their perception. And we talked about that a little bit last time. I'm not going to go into all of that again, but that's one of the huge blind spots of modernistic epistemology, is they want to start with the idea that, oh, we have a grounded sense of reality and we can get to this pure, precise knowledge without them ever giving any good argument of why their perception or their reason is something to be trusted. And especially it's really ironic as modernism then moved, especially empiricism, towards this godless approach that was, brought, even adopted more by empiricists and atheists and Darwinists like Hume and Darwin and others, that they just smuggled in this idea that, well, we can actually have a grounded sense of knowledge. And then they tried to arrogantly say, and we're the ones that can adjudicate that in our decontextualized test tubes. Trust us, basically, right. was the ultimate thing. It's like they want to deny faith and say, well, faith is not an actual modality of knowing, but then have faith in us that our system of rationality or empirical perception is true. And it's like,
yeah.
No, I'm not going to buy that anymore. But that is present in almost every single layer of our society. It's very difficult.
Right. And so that's that there's a ceiling. There's a ceiling to human capacity to know, and even a floor, if you will, that, the question always comes up in these discussions: how can we even trust our perceptions, right? Mm-hmm. How can we trust our own minds? You and I would say, because God created us, and because of what he said about us in his creation of us, that's how we can trust. These guys ultimately have nothing. They have no response to that in the end. And some of them will even say, you can't. Like you can't really know anything, which gets into the postmodern, rejection of all this is that there's no way that you can know that you can trust your perceptions. Mm-hmm. But that for us, that's rooted in the foundational knowledge. And I'll just leave with this, like, the ultimate test to me or a way to test, where your own mind is. If you come in contact with somebody who doesn't believe that there's any God, and you come in contact with somebody that doesn't believe that gravity is a thing, with the person who doesn't believe that there's a God, in our minds, we're like, yeah, I can still get along with this guy. I can work with this guy. I can function in society with him. But the guy that doesn't believe in gravity, man, I don't even know if I can live with this guy. Right. Mm-hmm. He just so fundamentally rejects reality. Can I suggest to you that the first guy that doesn't believe in God has rejected a more fundamental reality than the person who's rejected gravity?
Amen.
And so I think we need to evaluate our own minds and our own priorities of knowledge and understanding that we've received. We've inherited these prioritizations, and they do affect the way we think, and they affect the way we think about God, which is why all this is important. Like, I'm not concerned about studying this just from a standpoint of knowing who people were in history and what they thought. I'm concerned with how we think right now, and this affects the way that we think right now.
Yeah. Amen. And I would like to, I don't know, I don't think we had put this kind of on our list of conversations, but specifically how this applies to epistemology, applies to our hermeneutic and our interpretation of things. I think that warrants a larger discussion. And hopefully, as we kind of go through both modernist and then postmodernist kind of philosophies and critiques, we can maybe then do some follow-ups and be like, okay, how is the modernist epistemology, cosmology, ontology still present in popular hermeneutics or interpretations or beliefs among our brethren, and then do that for postmodernism as well. Because Steve and I are not arguing for, we we have to place our stake in postmodernism because it fixed modernity, or modernity is the right answer and postmodernism is the boogeyman. We're actually trying to get us out of that kind of back and forth system. And oftentimes too, even with rationalism and empiricism, many times people enter into that discussion of epistemology already presupposing, oh, these two sides are the two sides. Like this is, you got to be on one side. You got to be a Plato or you got to be a Aristotle. You got to be with Descartes or you got to be with Locke. It's like one of those two. And it's like, pick a camp. And it's very hard to conceptualize of ways outside of that. So trying to say, all right, understand how these discussions came about, how they're impacting us. And yes, we're not overly preoccupied about everyone knowing the names or the dates, but understand how it affects you. And then where to go from here. Is not a retreat into modernity or postmodernity, not a retreat into rationalism or empiricism, but truly finding a biblical way. But in order to do that, you need to be able to understand how you might have been preconditioned, or the presuppositions you're bringing to the Bible that are blocking you or re-entrenching you into these other philosophies, rather than letting you to arrive to a truly biblical approach. So,
yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, great discussion. Appreciate it, Caleb. And we'll look forward to picking it up next time.
Next time we will be going on to cosmology, right? Of modernism. Is that right? Or what are we?
Well, I think individualism or cosmology, we'll hammer that out between now and next time.
Okay. On what we're going to discuss. Because I would really like to still get into, even though a lot of these bleed over, as we talk about epistemology, cosmology, ontology, I think it's what we're trying to do is flesh out the individual components of the modernistic worldview, so that from here on out, when Stephen and I say modernism, we have at least a pretty clear understanding of that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Great, Caleb.
All right, cool.
Good to see you.
Likewise. God bless. Take care.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.